those of you that haven't seen the domains, so it looks like this. So we're going to very quickly move our way through these 16 domains, and we're going to start with the first one, which I think hopefully is quite an obvious, and from the point of view of the Business Agility Institute, why they made that the center, the customer. So for those of you that followed this, I suppose, business agility space, you see that there's a lot of talk around, how do we make organizations more customer centric? How do we move businesses away from perhaps some of the thinking that permeated the 80s and 90s, which often seem to be more centered around shareholder value and other principles, to sort of come back to focus on customer. So customer in this context is not just for paid organizations, but it could be citizens, it could be internal customers, and it's basically anyone that the organization serves in pursuit of its purpose. So if we walk through there in terms of the principles, so in terms of the principles that talk around this concept of the customer. So understanding your customer, so that's effectively where we're using detailed analytics, market research, conversations, personas, various other tools to really get us a deep understanding of who our customer is and what their needs are. Other things that you'll start seeing as tools to help with the concepts like open innovation. So that's a term that Gary Hamel's now talking about in this book that's really interesting called Humanocracy. So open innovation is about not just having innovation top down, but how do you bring innovation into your organization? So that's often not only within people work in your organization, but actually getting innovation from your partners and crowdsourcing it as an example. So understanding your customer can come from a range of different approaches. Developing customer journeys. A lot of us in this Agile space will be familiar with the concept of customer journey, but that's really understanding the touch points from a customer's perspective as they interact with us. Some good examples, not only in the business context, but in government. So for example, I know in the New Zealand government, they've been using this to sort of look at life events. So things like getting married, what are the various things that you have to touch from that perspective in terms of getting married. And then this whole concept of trust, building trust with our customers. So we actually had a topic that we did on this about 2 or 3 months ago. So we spent quite a bit of time focusing on this because we saw this as a really underpinning concept, not only within an organization, but within a team. But I think the whole concept of trust now is, from a customer perspective, is really a complex one, because here we're trying to sort of marry the various stakeholders. So while obviously being customer centered means that we put the needs of our customers hopefully first, we also have to balance that with other needs as well, like keeping our people employed and also giving a return to the owners of the business as well. So that's a very tricky thing, and we've seen that sort of dilemma organizations are facing now in the COVID, where they're trying to balance customer centricity with also staying in business. So the next area we're going to move across to is workforce. So that's a sort of a strange way. I mean, workforce, that's our people, our staff. And if we think about how that impinges in the context of the business agility space, and what we now look at it from an agile perspective, is the concept of psychological safety. So again, most of you will be familiar with that through the Google Aristotle project and how important that is. In a New Zealand context, I think it's also really relevant too. Unfortunately, in New Zealand, we have quite a high level of workplace bullying, which I don't think is something that as a nation we particularly proud about. So I think this concept of psychological safety, about having the opportunity for people to speak out, is something that New Zealand organizations probably need to focus a significant amount of time around. How do we create that safety within our teams and organizations? Incentive schemes as well. So Gavin Coughlin, who's on the call, did a good session when we're in our first one talking about how it boosts, how they experimented with some new ways of providing incentives to the organization. So this really is about how do we move away from individual incentive programs to more team focused ones. So looking at, but also how do we also not lose the individual's contribution while we're doing that as well. So again, that's a tricky balance between having team focused incentives, but also still recognizing that, you know, individuals need to be incented as well. And I think related to that is this concept of pay transparency and fairness. There's a big movement now towards open salary, open information. That's an interesting one that we'll see how that plays out. And why that's important is we find when without this level of fairness, we see that, for example, in a lot of cases, women are not paid equally. And as we start moving and making this information more transparent, we start seeing how that changes inequity. And then this concept of talent acquisition, again, I think this is about adding diversity and thinking for the future in terms of not only what we need now, but what do we need in the future. HR's role, Cheryl's done a fantastic job, I think, in sort of raising awareness amongst the Agile and the broader HR community about their role in how do they shape or break this whole concept of an Agile organization. So a lot of the topics I've just mentioned are ones that HR really own and can shape and change. And then we move to the last area. So partners, in this case, this is extending the Agile principles to the people outside of our organization. So how do we have, how do we have our partners treated in the same way as our staff, hopefully, or our customers? So, and often in the way of that are things like procurement policies that can, that are well intended to actually provide fairness, but can become very cumbersome and actually very uncustomer friendly, as I've found myself working with a lot of organizations. I'm sure you have as well. So how do we bring Agile principles to things like our partners through procurement, also contracts as well? So, you know, when we move to the Agile world, we have to start thinking about different types of contracts to support the Agile way of working. And these can be the sort of challenges that we often face when we're dealing with traditional organizations. And also then, how do we bring partners on board as well? So again, if we see partners as part of our broader community, then we should treat them as well as potentially as our staff and have a specific process for bringing those people on board. And then the other one is the board. So if you think about, these are all the stakeholders that surround the customer. So now we're talking about a board on top of the normal things that a board does, which is really thinking about the regulatory compliance and the financial health and strategy of organization. We now see that boards could become a constraint to an Agile organization if they themselves don't shift and change. So, you know, an organization is only going to be as Agile as its least Agile part. And if the board is run in a traditional way with traditional ideas, the organization is not going to be able to really run in an Agile way. So understanding what Agile governance means becomes critical for a board, and understanding of how Agile organizations work becomes critical for a board. Again, a big shift in terms of how they look at information. So what sort of information do they need? What information are they provided? To be able to think, you know, to actually understand enough to be able to do that, their role is actually a big shift. So we're starting to see education from the board of, you know, Institute of Board, you know, for example, we used to, in SoftEd had one of our board members, Melissa Clark Reynolds, and she's doing some sessions on digital awareness. So we're actually starting to see this sort of thing starting to be done at the board level to make sure that they actually are there to be able to support an Agile organization.
there was a question about what the horse's ass award is. And I put that up there, so I just thought I'd answer that before we move on to the next section. So in a company I worked with, we wanted to get people to, be more open about the things they were trying, and things where work didn't work out as people expected. So we went and we bought a trophy of a horse's ass. And what we did is, anytime that we did something that didn't work as we expected, anytime we failed, we would go. So I was like acting as a manager there, and we had like 3 or 4 other managers. We as managers would go and pick up the statue and say, this is what I did wrong, but this is what I learned from it. And the idea was to try and encourage people to own their mistakes and to feel comfortable and confident. Now, this was in Singapore, which is, a little bit more hierarchical and, a little bit more, face-based than New Zealand is. So what we found is, by, as managers, owning up to our mistakes and, admitting that we could be a horse's ass, it made everyone else feel a lot more comfortable to own their own mistakes as well. So that was the concept of a horse's ass award, just to sort of build psychological safety. But we'll go on to the next section now, which is about individuals. And so there's 3 areas that we want to talk around here. The first is around this thing called a growth mindset. And the concept of a growth mindset is basically that it doesn't matter how good or how bad you are now. You can always learn, you can always improve, you can always get better. And so what we want to encourage when we're working in, business agility is this concept of, I don't need to be an expert right now. I don't need to be a master right now. But what I'm willing to do is to try and learn and try and improve, right? And the reality is, you need to suck at something before you get good at something, and you need to get good at something before you get great at it. So we all go through this learning experience. That's what we want to achieve with the growth mindset. The principles it mentions here is, say, excuse the typo, but I don't know yet, right? So it doesn't mean I can't learn it. It just means I don't know right now, but I can go and learn, right? I'm going to get better. Celebrate failure and learning, right? The horse's ass was an example of us for that. But the reality is, if we're pushing ourselves to our limits, sometimes we are going to fail. And it doesn't matter that we fail. What matters is that we learn from those failures. And then the last one there is shorten feedback loops, right? So what can we do to make it so we can learn as quickly as possible, so we can improve as quickly as possible, right? And so you think about like the traditional method. For example, you do an exam, and then a few weeks later you get your exam result back. You don't learn effectively from that, because the feedback is so far delayed from the incident that it's difficult to learn. A counter example to that, in China, if you go past a speed camera and you're speeding, you get a text message to your phone instantly to tell you, hey, you were at this exact location at this time and you were speeding, right? Within seconds of getting caught by a speed camera. So that fast feedback enables you to learn, at least don't speed in that particular area. So this is sort of the concept of the growth mindset. The next area is ownership and accountability. And so what we want to do is to let people take responsibility for their own actions. A lot of the time we can choose to deny there's a problem. We can ignore the problem. We can, act with shame when we're responding to the problem. But instead what we want to do is we want to take responsibility, and we want to take accountability. Doesn't mean saying that it's my fault personally that this situation has happened, but it does mean saying, what can I personally do to help this situation, right? We have some principles here like giving authority. So letting people actually take responsibility. And sometimes that means understanding that people are going to fail, but being comfortable with that. But by giving people authority, we get much better results. We get much more buy-in, right? Second principle there is aligning to outcomes. And it's really important that it uses the word outcomes, because a lot of organizations, rather than being outcome focused, are output focused. They want to know, how many features did we ship in the last quarter? How many lines of code did we push? But actually what's more important to understand is, what is the value that we achieved? What are the outcomes that we realized, right? And then the third area is creating autonomy, giving people the freedom to do great work. And rather than micromanaging and thinking that as the manager or as the leader, I know best, instead trusting that the collective wisdom of the team and of the individual is more powerful, right? They're the domain experts in the areas that they're working in. So we give them the autonomy to do great work, right? So this is ownership and accountability. And then the last area is craft excellence. And, I always go back to the story that I heard a long time ago. And the story is that someone was visiting Europe, and they were walking past, through like Barcelona, and they saw a guy at the side of the road. He looked a little bit rough. He was, had a fag hanging out the side of his mouth. He was, building something. And so the person goes up to them and says, hey, what are you doing here? And the guy turns around real gruff And he says, I'm laying bricks, right? And she's like, oh, okay, sorry to interrupt you. I was just interested to see what was going on. And she wanders down the road and she sees the next person. And this guy looks a little bit more diligent about his work. He's a little bit neater, taking a little bit better care of his tools. And she says to me, excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but can you tell me what you're doing here? And the guy turns around and says to her, I'm building a wall, right? So he's a little bit more engaged with what he's doing. And then she goes along and she sees the third guy, and he looks really passionate about what he's doing. He's completely engaged with it. All of his tools are immaculate. He really cares about what he's doing. And she says, excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you tell me what you're doing here? And the guy turns around and puts his tools down carefully, and he says, I'm building a cathedral, right? And although each of them are doing the same thing, the way that they engage with it is different. And, you know, at that highest level, that is the craft excellence, right? It's the passion for what we're doing. It's the diligence of what we're doing. It's about how do we do, you know, this to the best way that we possibly can. And so some principles here is adopting agile techniques, automating repetitive work. I call this facilitated laziness. How do we avoid doing work that is of low value, or how do we automate the things that we can? And then measuring the quality of outcomes, right? Because a lot of the time, if you talk to people, you talk to organizations, you ask them, you know, why do you do the work you do? What is the value of your work? We don't know the value of our work. You know, we just know that we have to build a widget. So how do we understand why we do the work that we do, right? So that's craft excellence.
The next area we're going to look at is leadership. So we sort of briefly touched on this in the last session as well. And obviously in the Agile world, we focus a lot on teams and team health. But I think that this concept of leadership is always going to be one that is important to actually enable, you know, business agility. And by this, we're talking about how does leadership evolve? You know, Rob, for example, on the call, has written a book on Agile management, and that's, you know, a set of really good principles that he's sort of unpacked for leaders to understand. So, and there's a lot. I think that's probably how I would look at it. Is there's a lot of unlearning and relearning for leaders of all levels across organizations. So if we look at this concept, you know, of leadership, so you know, leaders developing an agile mindset is key. I just mentioned before how, like Microsoft, we see a really good example with Satya Nadella coming in, how his approach to moving the organization from being a know-it-all to learn-it-all has really helped model how that organization starts to think and act as well. So leadership, you know, from the top and at all levels can really reinforce this across the organization. So that was a very good example of at a top, you know, talking about whole growth mindset and leading it from that as well through his actions. The whole concept of one team. So actually, there's a couple of the little points to building empathy. So again, in an agile organization, we're moving away from the concept of the leader telling you what to do to one where it's through influence. So as we're all leaders within our own area, and so we have to get good at actually leading through influence rather than from leading through positional authority. So building empathy, understanding, shared understanding becomes important in our role as a leader, rather than coercing and telling people what to do. And again, we've talked in the last session with Jacob about outcomes as well. So rather than tell people what to do, it's really create a shared understanding of what we're trying to do, and then allow the people to figure it out and support them in their struggle to do so. So then we move across to this concept of one team. So that's the whole purpose of that. Obviously, we're going to be in small teams, but at some point we have to unite together to actually collaborate as a whole. So that's the whole purpose of there, is how do we create a collaborative organization that is united behind a common purpose and working to a consistent set of metrics potentially and shared understanding of our customer. So there are various principles that underpin that. So that comes down to purpose. So really understanding what the purpose of the organization is, being clear about that. Surprising how many organizations I deal with, people aren't clear about what the organization's purpose is. And therefore, how do you rally behind it when you don't understand it? Chartering, for all of us Agile coaches and so on are used to this principle, but actually, you know, create a shared understanding of what the purpose of the team is and create shared understanding of the rules that sit behind that is a key part of that. And then this concept of strategic agility is really, I think, a big focus at the moment. So I don't think, well, no one could have really foreseen what's happened this year. So how many business plans were able to cope easily with this situation? How much time was invested in, in planning, in budgeting, and all these other time-consuming things based on assumptions that were completely wrong. Not that anyone could really have foreseen that, but I suppose the reality is that we are living in a much more dynamic world. And so how flexible is our ability to be able to respond to changes? So that's really about how do we create emergent strategy, that allows us to sort of respond to various situations as they unfold, to create that seeing organization rather than one that's command driven from the top. These are all the things that, regardless of COVID, organizations are going to be faced with or are already facing. So this concept of strategic agility becomes even more important. How do we get the intelligence from the organization to inform the organization are all the elements of strategic agility.
So we will talk about our last area, which is talking about operations. And there is, again, 3 key areas that we're going to talk about here. The first one is structural agility, thinking about how do you set your organization up in a way that supports agile ways of working. And if we look at the principles here, the first principle is creating value delivery teams, i.e. building long-lived cross-functional teams that can actually get the work done. A lot of the time we set our organizations up based on skill. We've got our development area, we've got our testing area, so on and so forth. But independently, none of these areas actually have the ability to deliver value, which means we're often very far removed from the value that we deliver. So instead, we want to create value delivery teams. Second principle is maintaining continuity of ownership. So what typically happens if we've got one area of our organization that builds the work, often we'll spin up a project to do that, and then we'll have a BAU team that is responsible for maintaining the work. And in my opinion, and I think in many others' opinions, projects incentivize not necessarily the best behaviors. As a project manager, my goal is to reach the project scope, right? So instead, if we can create a team that is dedicated to a product or a value stream over a long period of time, they also are incentivized to build and maintain a high quality product, right? Because if they build a good quality product, it's obviously easier to maintain. Shane has referenced, there's an amazing book that you should all check out, No Projects, #No Projects, if you look that one up. And then the last point is creating stable teams, right? A lot of organizations bring teams together for a finite period of time, and once the project is done, they break the team up. It's very difficult to build high performance if we have unstable teams, right? Changing even 1 or 2 people can affect the balance of a team. Sometimes that's reality, depending on what's going on in the team and the organization. But where possible, if we try and preference having a stable team, a group of people that can work together over a long period of time, we get higher performance, we get better work. So the next area is process agility. You can think about how do we design our processes in a way that support us being more agile, because obviously processes have a big influence on how we work. The principles here, the first one is mapping the value stream. So how does work go from idea to delivery to maintenance in our organization? And then what are the steps that happen in the process, and how can we optimize the flow as it goes through that process? How can we make sure that we're working in a fast and efficient way? And the second principle there is adopting agile methods, and whatever agile method you choose to use, like making sure we're adhering to these agile principles and understanding what the principles mean. And then the third point there is moving to audit governance, which is maybe a term that you haven't heard before, but essentially what this means is, you remember the traditional approach to managing work is we've got a steering committee, they'll review a report once every X period of time, and it says that currently the project is red, green, or amber. It doesn't provide very much information. Audit governance instead means let's inspect and adapt on a regular basis. This is the outcome we're aiming for. Have we achieved this outcome? This is the work we said we're going to deliver. Did we deliver it? And what was the outcome that was realized from it? right? So we want to inspect and adapt based on real work. And then the third area is enterprise agility. And certainly when you get to larger organizations, there is more than one value stream inside the organization. Potentially they're developing multiple products in multiple different areas. And we need to understand what is the interaction between those different areas, and when and where do dependencies exist. How are we going to manage those? How are we going to make sure that we can work together effectively as an organization? Second principle is creating an adaptive portfolio. And essentially what that means is, rather than just funding a particular project, we want to think about initiatives over a long period of time, and we build a backlog at the highest level. Some people might call this a portfolio level backlog. Whatever you choose to call it, we want to understand what are those things that are going to move the needle for our organization, what is the work that is involved, and then make sure that we prioritize or order those pieces of work against each other. So we're always doing the next most valuable piece of work in our organization, rather than doing a project just because that project's been funded, because often that's not the next most valuable piece of work. And then the third point is funding outcomes or funding teams, right? So if we keep a team dedicated for a long period of time, it doesn't matter what work we're feeding to the team, as long as the team has the appropriate skills. Again, that enables us to build high performance. Outcomes is a very similar concept, right? If we know what's the value we want to achieve, there's lots of different ways we can achieve that value, but we know what the outcome is, and then it's up to the team to think about, okay, how can we deliver those outcomes?
That was the hardest one.
I think, yeah, I was observing to Rob, you can sort of tell by the volume of stickies people put down for various things, how well understood the various concepts are. And so, like, you know, when I looked at the top, like customer and workforce didn't have a lot of content or principles, sorry, you know, sort of practices attached to them. And enterprise agility, again, doesn't have many practices attached to it. So I think it shows how well understood these things are. Yeah, and the question from Jessica, what's the difference between structural agility and enterprise agility? Someone else might have a better answer than me, but my answer to that would be structural agility is how do we set up groups of people or, you know, elements of our organization working together in a way that they can deliver work most effectively and support that work long term. Enterprise agility is how do we build an organization that, how are we going to make sure that we're always doing the most valuable pieces of work, and that where those opportunities for cross collaboration exist, that they're well executed upon. So how do we get the entire organization working well together versus the structure? How do we get, you know, elements of the organization working together, you know, the teams and the people, if I could put it that way.
Yes, as maturity happens in this space, that those things stop being so separate, and that the value stream and the structure becomes the one thing.
I mean, I still think there's elements of it. Like Ahmed Sidki, you know, the sort of co-founder of IC Agile, puts it the best, in my opinion, you know, with his sort of organizational hierarchy he's got. And he talks about people, process, strategy, structure, and leadership. And all of those are elements that need to move if you're going to transform. And I don't think you can ever, you know, ignore one of those elements. But as you say, like, they'll achieve different levels of maturity. And the more mature you are and all, obviously, the more mature you can be overall. And I would say, you know, the structure and the enterprise, like, you know, very much the same thing. Like, you want all of these things to be moving, you know, but as you say, as you advance in maturity, perhaps they start to merge and you'll see more commonality between them. Challenges might be different.
On the structural versus the enterprise agility, you know, the McKinsey 7S, where we talk about the structure, the strategy, and I see the enterprise agility as a strategy part of it, which fits in really well, and the structure is quite different as well. So I can see both, they're quite a distinct between those two areas. So it makes sense to have two separate things.
I think, you know, reflecting upon it, there is a lot of content to try and get through in not very much time, and we really did want to keep it as sort of an overview while inviting some participation from the group. The other thing that we're particularly interested in finding, if you have examples of New Zealand organisations that you feel are applying any of these areas well, we would also love to get some local relevant New Zealand examples of organisations that are doing these things. I think between, you know, the sort of committee of the Business Agility Meetup, we've got a few, but we'd love to hear your examples of New Zealand organisations that are doing any of these things well as well.
We want this to be living, you know, a living resource, so that as you're starting to think about business agility, then you've got a place to go and hopefully sort of think about practices and principles you can start to experiment with in your organizations. And we pull apart this nebulous you know, topic into something a bit more tangible and with examples. So that's the next step, I think, as Jacob was saying, is that we want some examples of, you know, local organizations that are doing or applying these principles and practices so that people can feel that they're not alone.
And remember that nothing's perfect, so we don't need perfect examples. We need people who are trying rather than being unicorns.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I suppose the it is aspirational, you know, just taking all, but we certainly patches here and there in especially in our organization. But yeah, certainly happy to share.
Yeah, you know, this is sort of very aspirational, and there would be no organization probably on the planet that would do all of these things all the time. It would be, you know, there may be a few, but it's probably very unlikely. But it's something to try and, you know, at least aspire to, at least in some places, in some parts over some time. And the more we can give people examples and confidence that it's possible, the more we can evolve our organizations to a better place. That's our sort of our goal, is to, you know, bring the human aspect back into a lot of organizations. For those of you who haven't read it, the Humanocracy book is definitely worth reading. It's quite provocative and thought-provoking, but it has a lot of good, I think, principles and strategies that, you know, that make sense from my perspective, obviously.
Oh, I got a question. Yeah, I'm working for a bank, so this question is kind of specifically in terms of like the banking situation and the legacy system they have and how complicated the financial area it is. So it's like if we're looking at this framework, like imagine there's a CIO office and we have like people working in the CIO office directly. We have like middle management team, and we have like developer and tester in the individual delivery team. So for those people looking at this, how would they know like what would be the best way they approach some of these principles, and how they can create like kind of alignment across those three groups of people?
Good question. I mean, I'll give my 2 cents and then other people chime in, but what I suppose tend to start now with is to sort of, you know, looking at the bank's purpose, and, you know, hopefully that's clear and obvious, to create or hopefully have a set of principles that you can develop, or that binds together, you know, what to shape towards that purpose is probably the best step if it doesn't already exist. So what people tend to often do is sort of go to practices. So try doing things, but not in support of, there's, you know, not clearly in support of anything. So the principles is the good place to start. So what are we trying to achieve, you know, as teams together, in support of our purpose? And then what principles can we borrow from all of these things we've talked about that help do that? So that's a really good place to start, because that's a really good conversation to have, is, you know, what are the principles that we should care about as teams, that in support of our customers, internal or external. That's my sort of starting point. I think a lot of people dive into practices without that sort of really clear idea of what they're trying to actually do.
So does that mean it will be ideal if the high level management team to have a look at this first, rather than directly encourage the development team to go ahead and try some of these practice?
I think the
Ultimately,
teams
there's
could,
no one size fits all to that. Like, I
Yeah.
want to give you 2 examples of organizations I've worked with that transformed to Agile. Or,
Yeah.
so actually, one of them is an example from a friend of mine who was the first Agile coach at Amazon.com. And the way he described Agile at Amazon, he calls it Agile by apathy. So basically, him and one other team went to their management and said, hey, we've found a different way of working. Do you mind if we work like this? And the management said, we don't care what you do as long as you don't bother us and you get the work done, which is, you know, not a very supportive approach, but that's what happened. And so what he did and his team, the other team, was they started applying some Scrum principles. They gradually improved things over time. And it got to the point where a couple of teams that were near them could say, hey, these guys are doing much better than we're doing. What are they doing differently? And they started adopting those practices, and then a couple more teams and a couple more teams. And eventually it got to the point where so many teams had adopted this way of working that the organization could say it was actually quite impactful for them. And then they mandated it as an approach that they wanted all teams to take. So that's one approach. Another approach is, I spent some time working with PayPal. At PayPal, they said, we recognize that our situation, there is so much competitive intensity. We want everyone immediately overnight to change to this way of working. Over the period of about 3 months, they trained about 5,000 people worldwide to try and adopt these new Agile ways of working. They invested millions of dollars in training, hiring Agile coaches all around the world to make sure that they had the support they needed and to get it done as quickly as possible. And so I don't think either of those is necessarily a right or a wrong approach. Every organization is different. So like, start with what you can do. I think a lot of the time people tend to focus on, well, our leadership's not very agile, therefore we can't be agile. If that's the case, think about what can you do in your team and start with that, right?
Right. Cool. Thanks, Jacob.
Yeah, you did make them laugh. Well, if that's it, maybe we wrap up for now, and we'll be available.
I will make presents for you.
And Elon's going to make presents for all of you.
oh,
Don't hold
that's
me
very
to
nice
account
of
for
him.
that.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank
All
you.
right, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks,
All right,
all.
thank you. Thanks.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.